Speaking to us today in his capacity as Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, we have Professor Sir Peter Gluckman. Sir Peter has a very distinguished and extensive CV, beginning with his training in paediatrics and endocrinology at the Universities of Otago, Auckland and the University of California in San Francisco. In 1980, he came back to New Zealand to establish a research group in perinatal physiology, and he was later appointed as Chair in Paediatric and Perinatal Biology and Executive Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Auckland University. In 2001, he was appointed as Foundation Director of the Higgins Institute for Medical Research, also at the University of Auckland. Sir Peter's research has encompassed the regulation of fetal and postnatal growth, nutrition, obesity and diabetes, and in particular, the developmental origins of metabolic disease. As a scientist, he's published over 450 peer-reviewed papers, 150 reviews, and he's written both technical volumes, books, and also books more accessible to a popular audience. He's been very active in promoting the public understanding of science, and this is an aspect of his career that's taken on greater and greater importance over the years. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand in 1986, conferred a Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 1997, and a Knighthood in 2009. He's a University Distinguished Professor at the University of Auckland, and also has a visiting chair at the Institute of, in Singapore. National University of Singapore, I beg your pardon. In 2001, he was awarded the Rutherford Medal, and he's also received numerous other national and international scientific honours. In 2009, he resigned as Director of the Higgins Institute on accepting the role as New Zealand's first Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, which is a very, very important role for those of us who work in science and medical and health research. The format for this lecture is that we try and leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions before we close at 1:30. Professor Sir Peter Gluckman is going to be talking to us about setting priorities for science in New Zealand. So I'll open for you, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Science has a broad range of meanings and approaches, although at its heart it's really a set of systematic processes for gaining knowledge of likely reliability about the world, about the way we live in that world, and the world we create ourselves. Indeed, you could argue it's the only methodology we have for obtaining likely to be reliable knowledge about the world around us and about ourselves. And so when one comes to a discussion of priority setting in science, one can look at it in different ways. The traditional way has, I think, been rather linear and misleading. That is, categorising it from basic science to applied science to developmental science. And I think that's been dangerous. It's descriptive rather than utilitarian, and has a number of dangers I'll allude to. The presumption of linearity from basic to applied to development has led to the presumption that there's a defined pipeline from one bit of research to its application. And that presumption has dominated in our funding system since 1992 and has led to the expectation by the funder, primarily the foundation, that every bit of research will have a defined, impactful outcome, often of economic importance. That's been unrealistic for both the funder and for the provider, and has led to, I think, a large amount of cynicism about science, both from those who fund science and those who undertake science. It also has the presumption underneath it that the science and innovation ecosystems are part of the same thing. And what I want to point out to you today is that science has a much broader range of roles than just innovation. Innovation is not, which I won't talk about much, is much more than just science-based innovation. And although the two ecosystems interrelate, and very importantly interrelate, they're not the same thing. The other problem about the terminology is that what might be basic research for one discipline is not necessarily basic for another discipline. For example, in my own research, I started my life studying and spent a decade studying the intimate details of how neuronal hormonal control of pituitary hormone secretion in the fetus developed. It still has no application 30 years later, but directly embedded in that research were the discoveries that led us to the development of the cool cap, which was the first successful therapy for preventing cerebral palsy due to birth asphyxia at birth. And that's why the late George Porter, who was a president of the Royal Society of London a long time ago, once famously said there are only two kinds of research: applied and not yet applied. And as those of you who are in medical research here know, and was well documented by the late Julius Conroe in his famous book Retrospectoscope, well over 50% of medical research discoveries have their application in fields well remote from the field in which the original work was done. And I'm going on about this because I think this issue of what is basic or blue skies research is a problem. It's a terminology which in some minds implies that research is a luxury or an indulgent. Of course it's not, but these terms have come to be seen by a number of people in that way. A more useful terminology might be discovery research, implying that the finding of something new is important rather than those other kinds of research which build on and consolidate from those new findings. Or perhaps it would just be better to talk about the honesty. There's research which is led by the imagination of the investigators, and there's research that's led by a strategic intent of either a public or private sector funder. Do these names matter? Well, to the scientist, perhaps not. But to the public and to the policymaker, they do matter because they affect the perception of what research is about. As Minister Joyce indicated last week in the launching of Building Innovation, which, by the way, despite its name, is not just about innovation, it's a very important document indicating the direction for science in New Zealand, where New Zealand is about to launch on a process of reviewing its science priorities, or at least the priorities of the state in investing in science. And you might need to ask, why do we need to do this? Well, simply put, no country can do everything, and small countries like us need to be very clear about why and where they wish to prioritise their science investment. One of the reasons, well, that's one of the reasons why, as was announced last week, we're having a meeting of small advanced nations in Auckland in November. This New Zealand-led initiative allows us, so that we can see and learn from countries like Singapore, Israel, who've been very successful in using science for economic growth, how we can actually design our science system and exploit our science system for better national advantage. And not only do small countries prioritise, so do the large countries. Not even the largest of countries can do everything in science. If you look at the EU, which as a supranational state, I guess, it's stated its priorities very clearly under its Horizon 2020 program. It sees three major domains. Firstly, excellent science, which includes what they call frontier research, which is what we've been talking about up to now, and promoting collaborative research and developing infrastructure and scientific capability. They see, secondly, using research to build competitive industries, and clearly the EU is going through a process of identifying where that will be. And thirdly, they have defined a series of fields for using research to achieve a better society. And they see 6 themes: health, food, energy, transport, climate, and building an inclusive society. It's a useful way of thinking about science, and one that has many advantages. But the Europeans start from a platform where the political understanding and the commitment to research has been long-standing. Some years ago, the EU set a target that countries in the EU should spend 1% of GDP on public R&D, and that the private sector should achieve a 2% expenditure on R&D. A number of the smaller countries, in particular the Nordics, have achieved that goal. Just by way of comparison, our aggregate goal, our aggregate investment at the moment is about 1.3%. So it's quite different in scale and magnitude. New Zealand has for decades been slow to embrace a science-based growth strategy, but I think in the last few years there's been an inflection point and things have started to change. And it's worth, before we discuss priorities, to ask why as a country we've been so slow to grasp the need to invest more in science. Firstly, we're a young country, and that's been used as an excuse, but it's no excuse. Israel's a young country, Singapore's a young country. They invest about 3 times as much as us in R&D. Secondly, and I think more relevant, as a country we still do not value intellectual discourse or quality discussion. By way of an example, and I don't want to overstate it, just think of the quality of the discussion we had about genetic modification a decade ago. It was a discussion based on emotion and rhetoric, with very little discussion of the scientific issues around it. We never first assured that the technology was understood, and then had a discussion about whether we should put limits on it or not. Thirdly, as a country, while we've used science a lot, we haven't sheltered a lot about the way we've used science. Our whole economy is dependent on science, on agricultural science, and not just dairy science, but soil science, biosecurity science, water science, a large number of areas. Without a science-based system, without that science, we would not have the most efficient agricultural production system that we have. And fourthly, as a country, we've been too lucky. Over the last 50 years, we've had an easy economy. We could sell milk and we could sell tourism. We've not had to face the many existential threats that have faced other countries. We're only now waking up to the fact that while we've been lucky, relying on milk and tourism is not enough to thrive in the 21st century, and that we're going to have to be cleverer. And because the world owes us nothing, if we want the standards of living, the levels of social cohesion and environmental quality that we want, it can't be done without economic growth. To ignore economic growth as a pathway to achieve environmental quality and social cohesion, as some might suggest, is, I think, unrealistic in a world of growing demand and expectations. New Zealand faces many challenges, but perhaps the biggest is how does one balance resource conservation and environmental protection versus resource use and economic growth? 2 important questions follow from this question. What trade-offs will we accept in these decisions, and how do we use choose which technologies to use to best effect, and when should we limit their use. Some might argue that we can ignore growth in this equation, but that's utopian. Sustaining 40% more people on the planet, many of whom rightly expect far better standards of living, will involve more energy, more food, more water, more medical care. And there's no getting away from that, even when we live in New Zealand. We can't look at New Zealand in isolation. So how do we fulfil what is needed while protecting an increasingly compromised planet? The simple reality is that everything we do involves trade-offs, even though we don't like to talk about them too much. Trade-offs are often portrayed as binary. More of this means less of that. But it's actually much more nuanced, with all sorts of interactions and feedback loops involved. But unfortunately in New Zealand, too much of the discussion has been trite in imagining that trade-offs can be avoided or things can be changed without trade-offs. A much more sophisticated discussion is needed, and science and technology are essential in informing the appropriate solutions, especially when we look at the interplay between the environment and other considerations. And I'm not saying here that the answers are technocratic, far from it. We live in a participatory democracy. The decisions that democracies make are always based on values. But it's far more healthy, and we're far more likely to find acceptable outcomes if those values are first informed by the knowledge which only science can bring. But to take the best from science, we need to consider how we can move from a rather limited understanding of new technologies, where there's often an accidental, or in some cases intentional, confusion between science and politics, values and philosophies. So in what ways can knowledge have a much stronger role to play in our society? We need to address this issue. We've also had a horrible tendency to confuse the technology itself with its application. It's generally the latter that society needs to control and limit, but we've tended in this country to focus on the former, and thus at times find ourselves boxed into corners we need not be in. There's no challenge that we will face over the coming decades that does not depend on science and finding an appropriate resolution. And I don't mean that this is science done in the laboratory or in the field. What I'm suggesting is that science must be owned and part of society, as society itself must control the dialogue on these matters. But sadly, we have a rather high level of dissonance between what we know and what we accept, sometimes to our cost. And I think if we look for one example of that, we only have to look at the potential global tragedy that might emerge because of the political rejection of the science of climate change in some countries. At the interface in all these decisions involving trade-offs is a complex interaction that's reflected in part by the concept of risk. And this is perhaps the biggest elephant in the room. Risk means different things to different people. Scientists may think in terms of mathematical probabilities. Politicians will think about it in terms of electoral results. And the public generally see it through System 1 thinking. That is, through instinctive and emotional thought. For most people, perceptions of risk are biased by who benefits. We have a different perception of risk if we think we'll benefit than if we don't think we will benefit from it. A simple example of that is we all take the risk of breaking the speed limit from time to time on the road if it's to our advantage, we think, to get to somewhere quickly. But we get awfully annoyed, don't we, when somebody else overtakes us at speed. Too often, I think, in what are going to be increasingly important discussions about this interplay between the use of resources of any type and protecting our planet and our environment and so forth, we've been engaged in relatively superficial, dogmatic and ill-informed debate. Often emotion has prevailed without knowledge informing the discussion. And I really think as this country matures, we have to work through to much more informed conversation. Now, this may seem a very lengthy diversion or discourse from talking about science priorities, but I've done so because I think it's absolutely central to thinking about the role of science in New Zealand going ahead, and therefore in setting science priorities. Because at the end of the day, public science is funded by politicians responding to the public. And if they don't understand the role of science in society, then we may not necessarily make the best of choices. So just now turning back to the topic of the talk more directly, of science priorities, I think it is useful to think in terms, as does the EU, about research which is investigator-led and that research which is determined by the objectives of the research itself, which is mission-led. This dichotomy both informs what kind of research is undertaken and the tools used to fund it. In terms of investigator-led research, most of which occurs within universities and to some extent in the Crown Research Institutes, we can see research for a number of reasons, but in particular we should not underestimate its cultural value and its capacity generation values. We should not underestimate the importance in New Zealand of research in its own right for creating a society that values knowledge for its own sake, for understanding our world, who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. And a very good example of that is a paper published either late last week or early this week in Science from a team of psychologists, linguists, evolutionary biologists and computer mathematicians in Auckland, led by Quinton Atkinson. It puts forward the evidence that the proto-language for English arose in Anatolia rather than east of the Urals. The paper, on one hand, highlights the value of interdisciplinary research. Here we have computational models developed for molecular and evolutionary biology being applied to linguistics. But the other exciting thing about the work is that the scientists, as well as publishing a paper in Science, also published a publicly accessible website in which the science, which is relatively erudite in the Science magazine, is written in a very accessible way. As I've said for a number of years, science is no longer done when the paper is published. Science is done when society understands the purpose and the objectives and the outcomes of that science. I think that universities as a whole, as they train the scientists of the future, are going to have to put a lot more intention and intent into ensuring that all scientists learn how to communicate beyond their own profession. I will not focus on the issue of building capacity and capability, that is investing in science education, science training, supporting a broad base of academic inquiry, building a research infrastructure, because I think the arguments for all of that seem obvious. There's, however, one point that perhaps controversial that I'd like to make, and I may get shot down for this. And that is, I think we need to be more realistic over making early decisions about who has the capacity to be a research leader, and when we identify those people, invest in them properly. Not even every science graduate needs to do a PhD. Not every PhD needs to do a postdoc. And not every postdoc can expect to become a research leader. With the massive expansion of tertiary education in the Western world, and with the growing need, which is for science and engineering graduates across the economy, this is becoming a much more urgent issue to understand. For far more people are being trained and growing up with the expectation to be a research leader than any system can possibly absorb. And thus, one of the challenges, I think, for any research system is to have a fair and appropriate way of managing career development so that we focus earlier on in the careers on who has the capacity to be a research leader and then invest in them well. International experience, particularly in small countries, shows that investing in the most talented individuals early in their career and then building teams around them produces a disproportionate amount of impactful research by any criteria, whether you look at high impact papers in Science and Nature, whether you look at the number of spin-out companies, whether you look at the amount of IP produced. It's quite clear that finding that rare talent, the next Paul Callaghan, investing in them early and building around them is a very important strategy. But for the last 30 years in this country, we've moved away from the emphasis on identifying people and focused on relatively short outcomes. So what I was saying is I think that the funding model that the Foundation developed 30 years ago and the way the CRIs were funded purely on a contestable model really took the focus off the way of developing the young career, of identifying those outstanding young scientists and bringing them through. Hopefully the new model for CRI funding with partial bulk funding will change it somewhat for the CRIs, but I think there's a real challenge within the university sector where the whole way the academic system works and the much expanded university base creates some real issues. I'd make one other point about frontier science, that is discovery science. In a technological age, it's quite clear that productivity growth can occur by two routes: absorption of knowledge from elsewhere or generating new knowledge. Now, one of the debates that's gone on in the public policy settings in New Zealand is to what extent do we need to do our own discovery research and to what extent can we build on importing knowledge from elsewhere. Experience has shown that as countries get more advanced, their economies get more advanced, economic growth does not come from just importing knowledge from elsewhere. Economic growth for countries that are still developing is built very intensively on importing knowledge from elsewhere. But even for small countries, small advanced countries, the evidence is quite clear is that self-generated knowledge is essential for economic growth. And while we will rely on imported knowledge in some domains, because we're literally too small to do everything, it's critical that in areas we choose to prioritise, that we have good frontier knowledge. The other generic point I will make is about multidisciplinary research. One of the issues that came out very clearly in the Transit of Venus Forum, which was held a few weeks ago and which I reported on last week, and you can see the report on my website, was growing concern about the fragmentation of the New Zealand science system. Small buckets of money, the PBRF fragments science activity, and our funding models do not encourage multidisciplinary research. Marsden Fund, the Foundation, even the HRC, I don't think really encourage multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. And yet it's quite clear that it's at the boundaries between disciplines that much innovation and new knowledge emerges. And as indeed was the case in that example I used from the work on language, on the origin of language from Auckland. And if you think about it, small countries should be exactly the place who have competitive advantage to promote multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. I think the 7 Centres of Research Excellence model demonstrates what can be done if models of funding are created that get away from either an institutional or a disciplinary focus. Again, I think that experience and the manifest evidence that interdisciplinary research is where so much innovation occurs will inform how the country thinks about the exploration towards the national science challenges which the government announced will work through over the next few months. So to get beyond the question or the domains of research for cultural value and consider other domains of research, what we might call mission-led or utilitarian research, I use a somewhat different taxonomy to other people. One that I think helps the public, officials and politicians understand what research can do for New Zealand. I'll list what I see these utilitarian classification of research to be, then I'll very quickly, then I'll go back and explain what I mean by some of them. I see research beyond the cultural use of research as having 6 values for the country. The first is to understand our identity. The second is to defend the country, and I'll want to explain what I mean by that in a moment. The third is to manage our resources. The fourth is to improve the efficacy of government expenditure and to inform policy. The fifth is for diplomatic reasons. And the sixth is to support economic growth. Broadly, we need research that enhances our national identity, be it to understand our peoples and their history, our indigenous flora and fauna, or our environment. I'm not going to expand on that because I think it's self-evident. But every every country needs to understand who they are, where they come from, where they're going, and include within that definition of we, not just the humans, but the land, the plants, the animals that are with us in that land. Governments have the primary role of defending us. And science is essential in that battle. And I'm not here talking about our army, our navy, or our air force. I'm talking about biosecurity. I'm talking about public health. I'm talking about social science research, natural hazards research, and related areas. Without biosecurity research, we simply would not have a viable agricultural economy. It's not often understood how vulnerable we are. The issues over PSA are minor compared to the challenges that face our 4 most important species other than humans: cattle and sheep, ryegrass and clover. All of you understand foot and mouth disease, so I won't go on about that. But the 2 grass species, ryegrass and clover, on which our economy depends, are very vulnerable to weevils and other such like nasties. And we rely entirely on science to keep them under control. Largely we use imported parasitoids, wasps, to actually deal with the weevils that would otherwise destroy our ryegrass and clover. It's really a very exceptional bit of research over a number of years from ag research that allows our grass to grow as well as it does. Similarly, in this audience, I need not talk about the importance of public health research and much social science research to protect our population. And need I say anything about GNS and the other groups involved in natural hazards research or the associated engineering community and seeing how important they are in New Zealand. While we look at Christchurch as a tragedy, which indeed it was, it would have been so much worse had we not had the engineering science and the earthquake engineering science that was applied there. We also need research to understand and best manage our natural resources for both economic and conservation reasons. We have a vast offshore estate and we need to understand it to manage it. We need that science to understand the trade-offs in deciding how, when and if we're going to extract resources and what technologies we should use and when we should be limiting their use. I talked about this at length last week in Auckland, and it's on my website if you want to read more about it. Conservation science is complex and can lead to important but not necessarily intuitive decisions. Again, we come back to the issue of trade-offs. At a high level, think of some of the difficult trade-off decisions that we might have in the future. Genetic modification has a difficult history in this country, to say the least. But would we accept genetic modification if it was the only approach that we could have to deal with opossums or to deal with cowrie buyback disease? I don't know. But these are decisions that may, in the future, be things that this country needs to think about. Would we be more accepting of increased resource extraction if the revenues that are achieved from that extraction were applied to more conservation research rather going off into the private sector? I don't know. Let me drill down a bit more on conservation research. Most decisions made about conservation are somewhat arbitrary. A line is drawn on a map and a preserve is created. But in fact, there's a large body of science that can be brought to bear in shaping such decisions. Has an ecosystem been preserved or not? Is there sufficient biodiversity and population density to be able to, for the species involved to be able to handle environmental change? Are buffer zones needed? How do we exclude pests and diseases from the designated areas? This kind of science has not been extensively used, but it exists. And for a country that's proud of its conservation estate, we could do so much more. And when it comes to protecting biodiversity and particular species, we need to think a bit hard about what we're doing. We tend to focus on a disproportionate amount of resource on a small number of iconic species or subspecies, often after that species has effectively reached an irreversible tipping point. But what about the less iconic species or of plant or insect, like, say, blowflies, that might be a keystone species in an ecological zone? What are the criteria that are making us value one species over another? What is the cost of protecting one subspecies that's gone beyond a tipping point against protecting entire ecosystems? Thinking on such matters is often emotional and uninformed by the analyses that we could use to develop better strategies so that we actually protect species before they get to the tipping points, after which time it's very hard. As I've said already, the next category in my taxonomy is research that supports government expenditure and policy development. This is an area which I have been giving much focus. Many people think that science advisors' role is to advise governments about the policy for science. Much of it's about actually give science for policy, reversing it. A significant part of my role is trying to promote the use of evidence appropriately in policy formation. I don't have time to go into it in detail, but suffice to say policy is largely and appropriately driven by values-driven sets of decisions about things like fiscal priorities, public attitudes, political attitudes, and so forth. But policy made in isolation from understanding of the knowledge base is more likely to be based on dogma and belief, and is probably going to be less effective. We still introduce too many programs without piloting or evaluation. We still conflate scientific evidence with other inputs, seeming to think that science is no different from opinion, whereas good science should be values-free and provide the knowledge on which values are appropriately overlaid. And I was pleased last week to see that the Ministry of Primary Industries has responded to that by appointing a departmental science advisor, Dr. Ian Ferguson, with a role not dissimilar to mine. Equally, I'm excited by the fact that the government has a bill going through the House in the reform of the Families Commission, which will lead to a social policy evaluation and research unit. If you think about it, we spend $60 billion a year or more on health, education, social welfare, etc., etc. How much operational research do we really do to see how efficient and how effective those programs are? I'm absolutely convinced that more social science research, more operational research would relieve the governments on spending money on things that don't work or reinforcing things that do work. And I suspect that with that kind of analysis, it may be possible for some rather complex decisions which otherwise might be reacted to by the public to be implemented. New Zealand is a small country, and it has a real challenge in maintaining its relevance to the world. And increasingly, we recognise that science and diplomacy are interlinked in multiple ways, whether it be in promoting international research for collective benefit, such as the New Zealand-led Global Research Alliance for reducing emissions associated with agriculture, or for bilateral purposes as highlighted, for instance, the New Zealand Inc. strategies for China and India. But science is also important in protecting our international interests, be it in Antarctic research or in supporting some of our foreign aid efforts. And it's certainly an increasingly important part of trade negotiations, for example, the phytosanitary research necessary to support trade in food and other related goods. And I said all that, and I'm only now coming to the argument that's generally the most common argument used and is genuinely the right argument to use for why governments invest in science. And that's to directly support economic growth and innovation. As I've said earlier, the science and innovation systems are not the same, but clearly they overlap. There's many forms of innovation that are not based on science, and I've spent the last 40 minutes showing you all the forms of science that, while they may create innovation, are not there to drive direct business growth. They clearly overlap. But it is no doubt that science-led innovation or science-based innovation has been at the heart of the success of the other small nations we would like to emulate. There are all sorts of challenges implicit in this statement, the issues of how one gets science out of universities and Crown Institutes, how you get science into business, how you incentivise small companies, which is not the same as incentivising multinational corporations. But there are two questions we really need to ask. We should be defining and looking at ourselves carefully to ask two questions. What is it now that we do well and we could do more of because we know how to sell it? And that clearly leads you to the food industry. And second, and what we might do upstream to make the food industry or the timber industry more successful. And that immediately leads you back into the challenges of how do we get more out of, say, the dairy industry, and what trade-offs and what technologies do we need to do to conserve the environment at the same time. In the interest of time, I won't go off into a diversion about that issue, but it raises all sorts of challenges. And secondly, what is it that we're not doing now that we could do much more of, or we could where we have a competitive advantage? Every university, CRI, and business will have its own view of what we should do, what we're not doing now, where we could have a competitive advantage. But we need to think about it clearly. One obvious example, which we are working on, is advanced foods. Foods where scientifically proven health benefits can be demonstrated. The world, and particularly Asia, wants food for health benefits. Should we be creating a structure for doing more research on advanced foods? Should we be combining our outstanding medical research capacity with our very good food science capacity, and also building the regulatory regime so that claims for foods could be regulated and evaluated, created, that's something which is in the public domain the government is working on at the present time. There's a related question, which I won't go into again, but is what do we need to bring multinational companies back into New Zealand to do research in New Zealand? The experience overseas is the presence of multinationals doing R&D in an ecosystem helps build the ecosystem around it and support the small companies around it. We should be able to get companies that are interested in ICT back into New Zealand. We're going to have the SKA being built in Australia in the near future. How can we get companies that are interested in advanced foods active in New Zealand? These are discussions that need to emerge. So in summary, I think that we need to, in the coming months, in the discussion over science priorities, not lose focus on the fact that we need to be rich and therefore we need science to drive the innovation system. But if we look at that in isolation from all the other purposes of why we need science in society, then the investment will not be as successful as it should be. A mature conversation is going to be needed about the balance of investment across these various purposes of research and science. And we need to first decide why we are doing science before we can invest in the discussion about how we do science. It will only be once we understand what the priorities for New Zealand science are that we can turn our attention to understanding whether our institutions are fit for purpose for delivering it or not. Thank you very much.
Science and social justice. My sense in health research is that much more gets done on rich, white, middle class, elderly men's diseases than it does on poor, poverty-stricken children. And that we don't focus in terms of our scientific effort necessarily on improving the wealth of the whole community as opposed to the wealth of the community on average. Is there a role of science to be focused particularly around improving disparities, improving spread, if you like, as opposed to the community as a whole?
I'm not sure I'd start with your initial proposition as being correct. I think a lot of research is done worldwide and in New Zealand on social drivers of health and inequality. I think that research communities, researchers as individuals address questions that interest them. Governments can help set priorities for where they might go. For example, the Prime Minister at a speech in Auckland on Thursday night, and it's no surprise because he'd said it in his national goals, talked about his desire to see an intense effort around rheumatic fever. And so, and he actually committed in public to his willingness to support research towards developing a vaccine that might work for rheumatic fever. Whether that's possible or not, that's something I don't know, except I spent most of last Friday working for the Prime Minister's office on that question. My point is, and I've diverted a little bit, I actually think we as a country have not thought about social science research as social science research. We've seen it, it's been somewhat seen often as qualitative rather than quantitative, not given its emphasis. One of the reasons I've given a lot of focus in my report on adolescence, and the purpose of that report was to highlight what good social science research can do to inform policy. And I think one of the things that flow out of that and some of the other things has been this bill that I mentioned going through the House, which will set up a social science policy and research evaluation unit, which will have an academic advisory board to help ensure that the kind of research that the government needs to address the issues that you're interested in is undertaken. So I think there is a change underway about that, but I would take exception. Most medical research in New Zealand is actually focused on common diseases. Common diseases actually largely happen in poor, disadvantaged people or people from minorities. So, you know, diabetes research, et cetera, is largely about those people.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, Professor Gluckman, I'm from the Care Opportunity.
Can you speak up a little? My deafness is getting...
I think you've got a little bit of a problem. And the way I see it is that in order to have good science, you need to have honest science that's presented honestly to the community, as you mentioned before, if the public don't buy into it. And we saw recently with the folate situation in bread, some science that was presented quite inaccurately in the media. I myself fell for it completely. I watched the television and believed that in order for a woman to have sufficient folate to avoid spina bifida, she would need to eat 4 or 5 slices of bread. I thought, how ridiculous, another stupid idea. But of course, when we got to the fact of the matter, that was all baloney. And what concerns me is that the media will behave in that way and politicians will have their own agenda. But the rebuttal to that from authoritative scientific people in the community didn't occur. So unfortunately, the fortification didn't take place. And if we look at the science of it, we can assume there's maybe up to 25 to 30 women who now have children with neurotube defects. The same number as the number of dead miners in Pike River. So try not to be too emotive. I think you've got a real problem with a lot of honesty about the way science is presented.
Well, I think there's 2 issues there. I'm not disagreeing with the premise of your question. I think the role of people such as myself, public scientists, is to try and rebuild the trust in the science community. It has been disrupted by the media, who present balance as bias, as we saw in the climate change debate, where the scientists despite the overwhelming evidence in one direction, the media always made it into controversy, and in some cases still do. In folate, the same thing happened, and the public became uncertain and scared about the impact of folate on the food supply, that impacts on how the politicians deliver. That's why I pointed out earlier in my speech, scientists have to focus on the fact that science is not done just to be published in a scientific journal like Science or Nature. Scientists have to become better about communicating with the public. In Britain, increasingly, if you do a master's degree in science, or if you have a fellowship from one of the research councils, you'll be required to take courses in science communication. The problem we have at our end, and I'm conscious there's media in the room, so I've got to be careful, and the Dominion may be the best we've got, wherever you are, Dominion reporter. The worst is the Herald. I'm quite happy to be quoted on that. Is, for whatever reason in New Zealand, science communication has not been seen by the media as a place to focus on New Zealand scientists in an informative as opposed to contentious way, putting one against the other. Science is presented as a set of breakthroughs. How many times have we seen in the paper, cancer has been cured, diabetes has been cured, etc. You even see the same scientist doing the research, 5 different bits of research each time he's cured diabetes. I've always wondered about that. But the point I'm making, without being facetious, is we do not have a robust, mature media in terms of science communication at a very time when science is going to be a much more important part of a participatory democracy in deciding about what technologies to use and how. The example I would use is the Transit of Venus Forum. It was very well reported in Wellington by the Dominion in particular, and I mean, we all know about it here because of the influence of the late Sir Paul Callaghan. Believe it or not, it did not get one mention in the Auckland Herald, New Zealand Herald. Not one mention. It did not exist. Here we are, the most substantive conversation the country's had, and diverse conversation the country's had about the role of science in at least 10 years. I would argue much longer, because I don't think what happened at the knowledge wave was of a similar nature. And the only source of information effectively for a third of the country's population didn't even know it existed. So there are all sorts of challenges. The science community's got a lot to be responsible for in that. I think in the folate debate, the medical profession handled it rather badly. But I think that we have a problem that with 4.5 million people, for whatever reason, science communication is not given a priority by the media, despite the fact that my experience is the public loves the stuff. They do, and they're quite comfortable in getting information and digested information from good science reporters rather than just contestation and breakthrough stuff. I was once on the forum with the editor of the Wall Street Journal Asia on science communication. And he pointed out every year the 10 most read stories on their websites are always science stories. And they're not contentious stories, they're information providing stories. In other words, the public do want to understand. We're not very good at communicating it to the public, but we also don't have the tools to do so very well. It's actually very hard for a non-contentious, non-hysterical story about science to get into the media. It's actually very hard. Now, social media help a bit, and I think we're seeing an increasing number of good science communicators turn to the social media. But again, you have the problem. The social media, how do you discern reliable from non-reliable information? A recent study, I'm tempted to write a blog about this next week, looked at a simple question. What is the safest position to put your baby to sleep? Everybody knows, since the work was done on cot death in Hong Kong, New Zealand and Tasmania, that you put your baby to sleep on its back. The study from North America just blogged, or what do? You Googled the sleep position for baby. Only 45%, I think if I'm right on the number, of the sites that were referred to had the correct information on it. On something as black and white as that. And a number of the sites that had it wrong included even government-owned sites in North America. So that the issues of how we get, and if you've looked at the climate change websites, unless you are really a climate change expert, you try and look at a site like the British Government Office of Science site, which is a very good site on explaining anthropogenic climate change, with a lot of data, and then look at a site from a climate change denialist site, from one of the more sophisticated sites. If you're not an expert in climate change, you haven't got a hope in hell of discerning between one and the other. It's a complicated business.